Anthropogenic climate change is one of the most worrying perspectives that humankind could face. Climate change can seriously threaten the health and the prosperity of future generations. Energy and industry sectors bring together the largest contribution to greenhouse gases. The trend of carbon emissions has been steadily increasing since the Industrial Revolution, with more than 30 billion tons emitted in 2010. Another 17 billion tons of CO2 and CO2 equivalent emissions were emitted in the same year from deforestation, change in land use, agriculture, and fluorinated gases. Of the 30 billion tons of CO2 from fossil fuel burning and industrial processes, half of this quantity is absorbed by oceans and land vegetation, resulting in a net emission of 15 billion tons. This value corresponds to an increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration of about 2 parts per million per year. Paleoclimatologists use the CO2 trapped in ancient ice cores as a sort of time machine to study the early climate of our planet. For thousands of years, the CO2 concentration has never exceeded 300 parts per million. But the trend has changed after the Industrial Revolution, and we have now reached values above 400 ppm. The human interference on climate is clear. More than 20 years have gone since the first Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. This was the first venue in which global leaders agreed to curb anthropogenic emissions. As a matter of fact, we haven't reduced emissions yet. They have actually increased as both world economy and population increase in scale. The average global temperature has already increased by 0.7 degrees C, above the pre-industrial value. Experts claim that a temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius could trigger major changes on ecosystems and climate. Climate change will adversely affect food production and freshwater availability in several regions. Extreme weather events will also become more likely. Climate policy should aim at stabilizing and eventually reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to reduce the risk of catastrophic events. There is a strong connection between cumulative CO2 emissions and the Earth's surface temperature. As we increase emissions, our planet gets warmer. The 2 degrees C scenario corresponds to an atmospheric CO2 concentration of about 500 ppm. This would require an annual emission half the actual value by 2050. There are also socioeconomic and political consequences bound to climate change. Massive migrations caused by sea level rise, drought, famine, and freshwater scarcity will increase the risk of so-called climate wars. The economic impact of surviving natural disasters caused by climate change is expected to be huge. To keep us on track with the 2 degrees scenario, carbon emissions should not exceed a total amount of 1 trillion tons, which means we have already consumed more than half of the carbon budget. Policy instruments are needed to mitigate climate change. Especially, carbon pricing deals with the issue of externalities. Externalities indicate costs which are not covered by those who generated them. A smoky factory well illustrates this concept. The factory trades goods but does not pay for the pollution involved in the economic process. Carbon pricing is based on the principle polluters pay. Since carbon emissions impose high costs on society, emitters should pay for them. 2 carbon pricing mechanisms have been recognized so far: carbon tax and cap and trade. The former is straightforward since all emitters must pay a carbon tax equal to the social cost of CO2. The cap-and-trade mechanism is instead a market-based approach according to which CO2 emitters trade permits based on a given cap. By trading emission allowances, a market price of CO2 is established. Emitters able to reduce their emissions beyond assigned targets can trade their excess allowances. Alternatively, they can purchase permits to meet the imposed reduction targets. After the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Rio Summit, climate policy has been largely stuck. The ultimate objective of the treaty was the stabilization of greenhouse gases at a level that would prevent dangerous interferences with the climate system. The first major attempt to implement the UN treaty was within the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. Developed countries, known as Annex I countries, agreed to reduce their overall emissions to 5.2% below 1990 levels by 2012. Developing countries were left without any specific emission target. US, Australia and Canada did neither sign nor implement the treaty. The protocol was doomed to fail. In 2006, China's emissions surpassed that of US, making China the world's largest emitter. To date, the world has failed to implement the UN Convention, and a fully legally binding agreement on greenhouse gas emissions is still missing. Nonetheless, the Paris Climate Deal, signed by nearly 200 countries in 2015, represents a landmark target, and it is the first step toward fixing the problem after years of negotiations. The Paris Deal acknowledges that limiting the temperature below 2 degrees C is mandatory and sets an even more ambitious target at 1.5 degrees C. Mitigation and adaptation are key to face climate change. Not only we need to cut emissions, but we need to understand how ecosystem will respond and adapt to global warming.